In the final winter of World War II, the battle lines in Europe were collapsing. The German army was retreating town by town, leaving behind burned maps, broken weapons, and secrets they never intended anyone to find. Among the ruins of a half-destroyed village near Aachen, a squad of American soldiers entered what had once been a field command post. The air smelled of wet ash and diesel. On the floor, beneath shattered glass, they found a small leather-bound diary covered in dust and blood. The name on the first page had already faded, but the handwriting was clear, tight, disciplined, and almost obsessive. When the diary was handed to the intelligence unit, no one expected much. Dozens of German notebooks had been collected before. Orders, supply lists, sometimes poems or love letters. But this one was different. It began with cold daily notes about troop movements, and then turned into something far darker. The entries described fear, confusion, and a strange respect for the enemy across the lines. The author wrote of American soldiers with an odd mixture of fascination and dread, describing them as tireless, unpredictable, and, his word, inhumanly persistent. He wrote that every time his men thought the Americans were finished, the shells started again, louder than before. He wondered what drove them. Was it courage or something colder? For the intelligence officers reading these pages, it felt less like a soldier's diary and more like a confession. Each paragraph revealed how propaganda had collapsed inside the writer's mind. He questioned everything: his leaders, his cause, and finally himself. On one page, dated February 17, 1945, the ink ran sideways as if the page had been written during shell fire. He wrote, "We have built walls around our truth, but the Americans are breaking through them, brick by brick." The officers kept turning the pages, and what they found next began to spread through the camp like a whisper. This diary wasn't only about battle, it was about fear. The fear that the war had already been lost long before the fighting ended. The writer claimed to have witnessed something that changed how he viewed the enemy forever. The final lines of the section read, "They don't fight for orders. They fight for the idea that no one should ever rise again as we have." When this translation reached headquarters, the reaction was immediate. Some dismissed it as the ramblings of a broken soldier. Others believed it revealed how deeply the German command had begun to fracture. But for the men who had held that diary in their hands, it felt like touching the ghost of the enemy. They were staring directly into a mind that once believed it could rule the world, and now trembled before its own reflection. The diary was sealed in a folder marked Psychological Evaluation, Enemy Material. Yet copies were made, quietly, and shared among units as a kind of warning. It became an unspoken legend, a reminder that behind every uniform was someone questioning the very reason they were fighting. Part 1 ends as the diary is sent across the Atlantic to military intelligence analysts in Washington, D.C. There, experts would attempt to uncover who wrote it, why it was hidden, and whether the final pages might contain something even more disturbing. When the diary arrived in Washington, it was placed in the archives of the Military Intelligence Division, surrounded by piles of intercepted codes, enemy propaganda, and field reports. The cover looked unremarkable. Just a cracked leather notebook with a faint Iron Cross stamp pressed into the corner. Yet those who had read even a few lines knew it wasn't just another war record. The diary was assigned to a team of translators, linguists who had once lived in Germany before the war. They began the slow, careful work of turning every line of cramped cursive into English. The more they read, the quieter the translation room became. This was not the voice of a loyal soldier. It was the voice of a man who had started to see through the war itself. He wrote about the days before D-Day, when German officers stood around maps of France and convinced themselves that the Atlantic Wall was unbreakable. He described the speeches, the false confidence, and the way younger soldiers clapped because silence would have been dangerous. The writer called it a theater of obedience. Then came his first encounter with the Americans. He wrote that they moved differently, spoke differently, and seemed to carry the war without hate. They don't sing, he noted, but they never stop working. their faces are calm, even when they fire." It was a tone neither admiration nor fear could explain. It sounded like disbelief. One passage described a night raid near the town of St. Lo. The diary's author and his unit had taken shelter in a cellar while the ground above shook with artillery. When dawn came, he stepped outside and saw the American medics moving among both German and Allied wounded, bandaging whoever still breathed. "That morning," he wrote, "I realized we had already lost, not because our weapons failed, but because theirs had purpose." The translators passed those lines to the analysts. Each analyst wrote a note in the margin: "Psychological fracture, loss of ideology, empathy shock." They believed the diary revealed how Nazi morale had begun to break not from bombs, but from realization. As the translation neared the final pages, the handwriting changed. The strokes grew heavier, the ink darker. The writer spoke of rumors inside Berlin, of orders that made no sense, of civilians vanishing, of generals arguing behind closed doors. "We have begun to fear our own walls more than enemy shells," he wrote. And then, near the very end, one final entry stood out. The writer claimed he had been part of a meeting where senior officers reviewed captured Allied documents. Among them was a leaflet describing freedom, justice, and the rebuilding of Europe. He wrote that after reading it, the room fell silent. "No one spoke," he said. "We were looking at the world that would exist without us." When the translators reached the last line, they didn't speak for several minutes. It read simply, "If they win, perhaps mankind begins again." The chief analyst ordered the file sealed, but the copy survived. Over the following months, American officers used portions of the diary in psychological briefings to understand the collapse of German resistance. What had once been propaganda material had become something more. A mirror showing the human cost of belief. Decades later, historians rediscovered fragments of the original notebook in a private collection. The ink had faded, the paper was brittle, but the meaning was still alive. The words were not about victory or defeat. They were about understanding. The soldier who wrote them never signed his name, and no one knows what became of him after 1945. Yet through that diary, his voice continued to echo. A reminder that even in the darkest chapters of war, a single confession can outlive an entire empire. Decades passed. The war had ended, Europe was rebuilt, and the world had changed. The diary that once circulated through military intelligence faded into rumor, buried beneath newer conflicts and modern headlines. For most, it was a forgotten relic. One more story from a time too painful to revisit. But in the early 1990s, inside a small museum archive in Munich, a box labeled Private Collection, 1945, was opened for the first time in nearly 50 years. Inside lay the remains of the same diary, fragile, incomplete, and yellow with age. The curator who found it didn't realize its importance at first. Dozens of old notebooks sat in those dusty shelves, written by soldiers whose names had long vanished from history. But when she turned the pages and saw the English handwriting on the attached translation notes, she knew it was something different. The diary had traveled from a battlefield bunker to Washington, D.C., and somehow, after decades, it had returned to the land where it was written. Historians were called in. They studied the handwriting, compared the ink, and confirmed that the pages matched the original transcripts found in U.S. military archives. What made this discovery extraordinary were the missing pages, entries never translated, never seen by American intelligence. The last section was written during the final collapse of the Third Reich, when Berlin was burning and the Allied forces were closing in. In those final entries, the tone of the diary changed completely. The author no longer wrote as a soldier. He wrote as a witness. He described cities in ruins, families wandering without homes, and commanders who refused to surrender even when the truth was visible in the smoke. One line stood out to researchers. "We were told the Americans would destroy us, but they brought food before they brought fire." That single sentence changed how many historians viewed the psychological end of the war. It suggested that the fall of Nazi Germany wasn't just military, it was moral. The writer had seen his entire world crumble, not only from bombs, but from the collapse of the ideology he was raised to believe. The diary's rediscovery was quietly reported in a few German newspapers. But what caught international attention was a single photograph published months later, a grainy image of the open diary, with a note scrawled in faded ink across the margin. "History will remember what fear cannot erase." Scholars and war historians debated for years about the diary's true author. Some believed it was written by a mid-level officer from the 352nd Infantry Division. Others thought it might have been an anonymous translator documenting what he saw inside Berlin's ruins. The handwriting was too common to trace, and the records from that period were mostly destroyed. But what no one could deny was the diary's emotional power. Each word felt like an echo from a man standing between two collapsing worlds. One built on control and hate, the other on the uncertain promise of freedom. Today, the diary rests in a climate-controlled case inside a military museum in Washington, D.C., next to other personal artifacts of the war. Visitors rarely realize that what they are looking at once terrified the soldiers who found it. To them, it's just an old book. But to historians, it's something far more valuable. A silent confession from the losing side of history. The museum curator once described it best. It isn't just the story of a German soldier. It's the story of every human being forced to face the truth they tried to bury. And perhaps that's why, even now, when researchers open its fragile pages, they still pause at the same final line. The one that survived every translation, every archive, and every generation. If they win, perhaps mankind begins again. When historians completed the last translation of the diary, something unexpected happened. The story stopped being about sides, German or American, victory or defeat, and became something much deeper. The final pages revealed not a soldier of hate, but a man drowning in regret. He wrote, "I was taught to believe the enemy was less than human. But when I looked into the eyes of a captured American medic, I saw someone who feared, prayed, and bled just like me." That one sentence, written by a dying soldier in the chaos of 1945, echoed through the halls of every lecture room and museum where the diary was displayed. It challenged what people thought they knew about the war. It turned history from numbers and maps into something painfully human. The diary became more than evidence. It became a mirror. It forced both Germans and Americans to see how fear, propaganda, and pride had erased the lines between truth and lies. The author's voice, shaky and desperate, described how he watched friends burn cities they once called home. He questioned every speech, every command, every salute he had once given so proudly. One of the last entries read, "The Americans will win, not because they have more guns, but because they still remember mercy." Those words were found by the first American unit that entered the bunker where the diary was hidden. It was wrapped in a soldier's coat, protected from fire and rain. Nobody knows why he saved it. Maybe he knew, even then, that the words inside would outlive the war. After the diary's rediscovery, a small ceremony was held at the same museum in Washington, D.C. Veterans from both countries stood together in silence as a historian read the last paragraph aloud. There was no applause, no speeches, only quiet understanding. That final paragraph read, "We believed we were defending our land, but we were defending lies. If humanity survives this war, may we never again follow the kind of men who convince us that killing is duty and compassion is weakness." For a moment, the audience was completely still. Some veterans cried, others simply closed their eyes. Years later, scholars still debate the diary's true identity, who wrote it, when it was found, and what pages might still be missing. But what no one questions anymore is its message. It's a reminder that in every war, truth dies first, and that somewhere beneath the rubble, there's always one voice brave enough to write it down,